My name is David Malone, and it's my enormous pleasure this evening to talk to Philip Orr. Philip was for 20 years an editor of the world's premier science journal, Nature. He's an award-winning science writer and journalist, and presents science stories on BBC Radio 4. And his new book, The Book of Minds, How to Understand Ourselves and Other Beings from Animals to AI to Aliens. Philip, before we get started, they sent me a pre-publication copy. Do you have a real copy so that people can know what it looks like in the bookshop? There you go. Marvelous. Thank you. Thanks for talking to us this evening. It's a big old book, Philip.
Well, it's a big topic, and I've scratched the surface. That's the truth of it. It's an intense topic. It was very daunting to take on. I'm not sure that I should have done, but it's too late now.
One of the things that's really interesting about it is the title. You put the word minds on the cover, and a lot of books that cover this sort of territory, they have the word consciousness or self or brain or computer. And you didn't even write the book of the mind. You put minds. Tell us about the mind. Why the mind, Philip?
Well, yeah, you're right. It is an odd term. I mean, you sort of see it in these old books on philosophy of mind, going back to Gilbert Ryle, the concept of mind, or so on, in the mid 20th century. And I guess first of all, I think it's because I'm trying to talk about consciousness is one aspect of our mental experience. The mind, in my way of saying it, it's the totality of it. It's the totality of experience. And I don't think we really have a good alternative word for that. Consciousness, as I say, really doesn't do justice to it. But in the end, I guess what I arrive at is that mind is probably better seen as a verb than as a noun. So I talk about mindedness of matter. Mind as, it's something that we do. We mind in our lives. I mean, we use it as a verb in that sense, of course, but I'm thinking more broadly of we have experience. That's the nature of our existence. And so what I'm really looking at here is the nature of experience. And you're right, it's plural, because the only experience we ever have is not just human experience, but our own. So everything else we have to more or less assume in terms of what other minds are out there. But I think it's fair to say that there's a consensus amongst animal behaviorists, at least, that this quality of experience we have isn't unique to humans, that it's reasonable to think that some other animals, perhaps all other animals, and some people would even say all other living things, have some degree of experience. So that's really the aspect I'm trying to get at with this term mind.
Does that mean that you can imagine a mind, something that has a mind but isn't conscious?
That's one of the issues that I wanted to explore here. What are the, if there are any, what are the irreducible characteristics of having a mind? And the definition, and it's not a rigorous definition either scientifically or philosophically, but the working definition that I use is that in order to have a mind, for an entity to have a mind, there has to be something that it is like to be that thing. So I don't think that it's to be a rock is to be anything at all. I don't think there is something it is like to be a rock. Now, some people disagree with that, but that's my own view. If there's something like to tree, we can argue about that. There it's starting to get into a fuzzy area. I suspect most people would think there probably is something it is like to be a dog, to be a cat, certainly to be a gorilla. So that's really the issue that I'm talking about. That mind means that there is some sensation, some experience. Some people call it sentience, but for us, it's something more. There's something more to it than sentience. Where consciousness fits into that, I think, is somewhat unclear. I was quite interested in the idea of whether it's possible to have a mind that doesn't have consciousness. I certainly don't have the ability to imagine quite what that would be. But one thing that I do conclude is that it's not quite as simple as that, because I think consciousness itself isn't a single thing. It's not like
it's not an on or off, you're saying.
It's not an on or off. It's a continuum, but also it's not like a kind of a fluid or a quality that we have more or less of. I think, and it's not just me who thinks it, there are people who study animal behavior who suspect that consciousness itself needs to be broken down into different qualities, different dimensions, really, and different creatures will have more or less of those. So the nature of the consciousness of a dog, certainly of an octopus, is probably different from ours. And one thing I was interested to think about is, could there be qualitatively different kinds of consciousness that are really different from anything that we seem to recognize in other animals? So yeah, that's the sort of question that I was hoping to explore by trying to open up this question of what a mind is into, what are the dimensions, what are the coordinates of the space in which minds exist.
Okay, we'll talk about the different aspects of consciousness, but let's just situate the other thing that I'm quite fond of that I have, and that's a self. What's the relationship of the self to consciousness? Can you have consciousness? See, I think my dog is conscious, but I'm not sure it has the same kind of self as me. And I'm not sure that it sits there thinking, I'm a dog, but I wish I was a cat.
Exactly. I think that is one of the aspects of how we can break down consciousness. And in fact, the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio does precisely that. So he suggests that there are two types of consciousness, that there is what he calls core consciousness, which is this basically an experience, a sensation, you might call it sentience, what it is to be like, if you like. But then he says that we, at least, we humans, have also an autobiographical self, an autobiographical consciousness. That's really where the self comes in, this autobiographical consciousness. We have a notion that we are beings with a past that we can remember, with a potential future that we can imagine. And all of this, Damasio thinks, is mediated by language. We can articulate to ourselves what this consciousness is and articulate to others what it is. So in his view, the notion of a self does seem to be, if you identify it with this autobiographical consciousness, then it does seem to be bound up with things that, as far as we know so far, are uniquely human, and in particular the notion of language that allows us to articulate that idea. So, in that sense, if he's right, then it does seem to be likely that other animals, if they don't have languages, and there isn't really good evidence that they have languages in the same sense as human language, then perhaps they don't have this autobiographical self. But it is now debated whether it used to be thought that animals, all other animals, live in a kind of perpetual present. So they're just, flooded with sensory information, and they respond to it somehow. Not like a machine necessarily, but that's what they're doing. They have no sense of the future and no real concept of the past. Now we have good reasons to think that that's not so clear for animals, that there are some, and maybe we'll talk about, I won't go into detail now, maybe we'll talk about it in a bit. There are some experiments that suggest that some animals certainly have a notion of being able to plan ahead, being able to construct possible futures. That, the way we would think about it is they think, this might happen tomorrow, I better prepare for it now. Quite how that is articulated in the animal mind, we don't know, and we may never know, but there does seem to be some sense of continuity. So perhaps in that sense, at least, they do have some notion of a self.
So maybe the self, like consciousness, is not a sort of an all or nothing, because if the self is tied completely to language, then does that mean that children up to the age of 2 don't have a self?
Well, exactly that. And there are some philosophers who have argued that. Oh. I think it certainly seems quite a dangerous argument, because there are some, there is a tradition at least of attaching moral status really to the notion of a self. That that's really the label of personhood, if you like. That once we have a self, we are a person and we have moral rights. And if you have that view that that doesn't really exist for infants, then it's not clear what their moral status is. And there are some philosophers, a few, who have said, well, yeah, that's the way it is, that actually, children don't have, or very young infants don't have the same moral status as us. I think a lot of people, me included, would instinctively at least feel there's something wrong in that argument, that we as, I forget it, maybe Bean Damasio or who put it, that we deserve a better philosophy of mind than one that arrives at that conclusion. So, I would certainly think that's true. I think that there's also a notion that perhaps a sense of self arises from our ability to not just respond to what happens and make decisions, but to be aware of ourselves doing that, to almost stand outside of that immediate sort of mind dealing with the world and think, here I am dealing with the world, here I am doing this. But there are some indications that to some degree, other animals, birds and dolphins at least, can do that too, in the sense that they seem able to assess, what is it that I know and how well do I know it? How sure am I of what I think I know? Of course, they don't say it in those words, but that is the kind of process that seems to be required to make sense of some of the things that they do in some behavioral experiments.
You're talking about how you could have very different kinds of consciousness. Now, you talk about the octopus as a wonderful example, because they're very. We have a marine place down the road from us here, and they are fantastically curious creatures. I mean, the keepers always say if they can escape, they will, and that they're very clever. They can open jars and all sorts of things. Now, do you think that they're an example of a very different kind of consciousness?
Well, the really interesting thing about octopuses, as opposed to vertebrates, so octopuses are kinds of mollusks, so that they don't have a backbone. So unlike most of the animals we tend to think of, going into rodents or whatever, they're all vertebrates. But octopuses, mollusks generally, diverged from us in evolutionary terms much, much longer ago. I mean, before the Cambrian explosion, so about 600 million years ago. Our common ancestor was probably a very humble creature indeed, a kind of little worm with a very rudimentary nervous system. And so the way Peter Godfrey Smith, the philosopher, has written fantastically about octopuses in his book Other Minds. And he says that octopuses are really a separate evolutionary experiment in building minds, because they diverged so long ago, when before you might even want to say that the common ancestor had a mind. And what has happened with cephalopods generally, octopuses and squid in particular, is that they have a very different nervous system to us. So, for us, I mean, it's clear that our neurons are kind of are mostly situated in our brains, and it's clear that the brain controls a lot of what we do and how we think. But for octopuses, that is less clear. More than half of the neurons that they have, and they have about as many neurons as a dog, but more than half of them aren't in the central sort of brain in the head region. They're distributed throughout the body in the arms. And in each of the arms, there's a kind of little cluster of neurons, a ganglion, that seems to act to some extent autonomously, almost like a little proto-brain. It seems to have memory. It seems to be able to make decisions. And these other neurons are connected to the central brain, but it's not entirely clear how much communication there is, and there certainly seem to be times when the central brain of the octopus is probably just watching the arms go about their business, as though watching some other creature. It doesn't really know, if you like, what they're going to do. So it's a very, very, certainly a very, very different kind of neural system to us, and quite what that means for the experience of the octopus, it's very, very hard to say. Some people think that it may have a kind of dual consciousness, one in the arms and one in the brain, or even multiple consciousnesses. it's not clear to what degree they are integrated into a single experience. We don't know whether an octopus experiences the world as we do, as a kind of whole, an integrated whole. So in the octopus, it seems possible, at least, that evolution has shown us that minds don't have to exist as an integrated whole, that they can be more distributed and more fragmented, really. And, they can sometimes kind of come together and act together, and sometimes they can, each of these little proto minds can do their own thing. So, it's very hard for us to even begin to imagine what an experience like that would be. But what it also means is, as you say, octopuses have this incredibly rich range of behaviors. And we're often really, even people who study octopuses all their lives say, we're kind of guessing what's going on. We're kind of projecting our own assumptions onto it. So it looks as though octopuses just find, they just play with objects. They just kind of, unfamiliar objects. They seem interested. They seem curious. They play around with them. Is it play, or what is going on for the octopus? We just don't know. So yeah, it's a fantastic system, as Peter Godfrey Smith says, for imagining, in a very concrete way, what another mind might be like.
I mean, you talk about wondering whether they really are conscious, and you look at this in the book, that there's two opposing tendencies. There's one group who say, look, humans have a terrible tendency to anthropomorphize. Your car won't start, and so you blame it as if it was, you did this to me on purpose. But at the same time, there's the opposite tendency, this more scientific tendency, to go out of their way to deny what would appear to be sentience when it seems like it's the most parsimonious explanation. To say that chimpanzees are just elaborate furry machines and they don't feel anything, so it'd be fine to stick a knife in them, seems perverse. How did you navigate between these two problems?
Well, I think they kind of go hand in hand, because being aware of, and how could we not be aware of, as you say, our tendency to project minds everywhere. And of course, it's what we've always done. And we've explained things that happen in nature in terms of gods being angry and so on. Being aware of that, it is not just understandable, but actually necessary to be cautious about the interpretations we make when we are observing the behavior of non-human creatures. But you can take that tendency too far, and I think in the past it has been taken too far. So certainly the behavioral school of psychology regarded, so this is the B.F. Skinner and the behaviorist, really did regard animals as automata, that there was nothing really sort of going, there was no inner life. They were just responding to stimuli in a way that machines could do. And, they could be taught, they could be habituated to do certain things, but they weren't in any sense kind of conscious of deciding to do that. And that was really the dominant view for a long time, until, only a few decades ago, maybe in the 1980s or so, when behaviorists started to, or animal psychologists started to recognize that actually, as you say, there comes a point when you see certainly something, a chimpanzee, say, do things so similar to how we would do them in terms of, for example, its interactions with other chimpanzees, or its interactions with its young, that it becomes almost perverse, and certainly it becomes it becomes very convoluted to say, well, it looks, in all respects, as far as we can tell, like they're kind of doing the same thing as us, but they've actually got, very different reasons for doing it. They haven't got minds like ours. There comes a point when it's actually more economical to say, let's assume actually that they have minds something like ours, that something cognitively similar is going on. And of course, that's now the argument for that is all the stronger when we're able to use neuroscientific techniques to see what's going on inside the brain and to look at the structures of the brain. And unsurprisingly, given our close evolutionary relationship, there are lots of similarities. And but actually, it really comes much more from careful cognitive experiments of observing behavior in situations where we can really start to figure out how an animal, particularly other primates, are reasoning. And we can start to see that actually it really does look as though, for example, they are reasoning in a way that is they are attributing minds to their other creatures. They're thinking, in some cases, they're thinking, hey, I know something that, that other chimp doesn't know. And so I can use that to my advantage. Chimps actually seem to do that very much. So, that's something that seems to be, that they have in common with us. It's what psychologists call a theory of mind, which is not a theory of how the mind works, but an assumption that other agents have minds. So there are these, similarities, not just in broad terms, but in quite specific terms, behavioral similarities that I think create a very strong argument that certainly other primates, and I think many other vertebrates and perhaps below, need to be attributed minds that have some qualities, at least, like ours, that they're not just stimulus response automata.
Well, otherwise you're in the strange position of having to walk around London Zoo and say it only when we get to us, suddenly the whole thing, all of consciousness, things don't happen that way generally in evolution, do they? It tends to be built in bits.
Well, that's true. I mean, it is the case that occasionally in evolution we have seen sudden jumps, but there's nothing actually in the evolutionary record of primates that would lead us to think that. We see no clear genetic changes, for example, that correspond to what we might imagine, to the early evolution of very early humans. So yeah, there's no sign in the fossil record or in the genetic evolutionary record of sudden changes like that. In fact, the complexity of human behavior seems much more recent than that, when humans started to do things like make music, make art, develop complex cultures. There's nothing that corresponds, anatomically or genetically to any particular sudden change that led to that. So it looks like it's something else. So yes, absolutely, that too. We would expect there to be a gradual evolution of mind throughout evolutionary history.